Are you the parent of a PDA child or teen and you feel completely confused and overwhelmed about the decisions around screen time? You might be letting your child experiment with, 5 to 8 hours of screen time a day, especially if they're in burnout, but at night, you're maybe crying to your partner in the privacy of your bedroom, like, am I rotting my child's brain? Am I doing the wrong thing for their development? I'm a horrible, negligent mother. But if I try and get them off the screen, it impacts their basic needs. They won't eat, they won't sleep, they'll rage, and it undermines the connection and relationship, right? So I want to tell you, if this is resonating, that I am speaking directly to you today, whether it's here on this live or listening on the podcast. I completely get it. I have been there, and I have a lot of empathy for this topic and for you. So hi, I'm Casey. I'm the founder of At Peace Parents. I'm a mom of a PDA child who's now 10, and I have helped thousands of parents support their PDA children and teens to thrive, get out of burnout, and for the parents to find peace while they're parenting a child with this unique neurotype. Okay, so today we're going to talk about screens, and we're going to try and get some sanity while we're thinking about making decisions around screens. So the context is there's a lot of demonization about screen time use, right? This is in research, this is in pediatrician circles, society at large, parenting experts, etc. In some subsets, if you're a parent of a PDA child or teen, you may be exploring neurodiversity affirming support groups, learning from autistic adults, and you may be seeing another extreme, which is if you are putting screen time limits on your PDA child or autistic child, then you are not supportive of them. You are not affirming, okay? So as a parent, it feels totally overwhelming to be making these decisions. The stakes are super high. And so today I want to help you find a middle path with more objectivity, understanding of your kid's unique neurotype, and empower you to make decisions even if they look different from other parents with children who are PDA, neurotypical, or other neurodivergent neurotypes like ADHD, autism, etc. Okay, so we're going to do 7 things today. I'm going to move through it fairly quickly because there's a lot of content here for you all. I'm going to briefly introduce my story with screens and my PDA son when he was in burnout. I'm going to talk to you about the patterns I've observed by working with such a large sample of parents of PDA children, which is now over 1,000. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the themes that I've noticed and the trajectories of parents who have experimented with lower screen time limits. The third thing I'm going to talk about is the research and how to understand it through the lens of causality versus correlation. I'm a trained social scientist. I have a second field in social science methodology. So I am very well trained to digest research that uses social science methods. So I'm going to do some of that for you today. Number 4, we're going to talk about what's unique to you as a parent of a PDA child or teen and that people don't understand about screen time use and PDA children and the decisions within constraints that we're making as parents. Number 5, we're going to talk about a different way to view screens and make decisions. 6, I'm going to give you some practical tips that you can apply in your own home to help your sanity. And then I'm going to remind us, number 7, of the big picture and where we are historically in our use of screens and where we find ourselves as parents trying to navigate this uncertainty, which, by the way, none of us individually created unless you were one of the people working on algorithms in Silicon Valley. And maybe you were, no judgment. All right, so let's start with my story, which I'm going to share with you to normalize, I think, what a lot of you have gone through or are going through. So I was a very strict / mindful about screens mom, meaning I was trying to follow the pediatric guidelines around less than an hour of screen time use. I didn't introduce screens or allow screens until my son was over 2 years old, when sometimes my mom would be like trying to give him songs to listen to or show him pictures on a screen when he was a baby or a toddler. I would get really mad at her. I was like, don't let him see screens. It's going to rot his brain, right? So I was very much of the camp of like, limit screens. I don't want them around. And I held that boundary until he was about 5.5 years old. At a very, very large cost to our relationship, his nervous system well-being, and actually, I think it's part of what caused burnout, okay? So as a reminder, our children who are PDA have cumulative nervous system activation over time. What does that mean? That means every time their survival part of the brain, that red part, the amygdala, is perceiving threat, their body's going to go into fight or flight or freeze or shut down, which is a survival response. What's unique about our kids is that happens anytime we're imposing limits, they're not having autonomy, or we're putting ourselves in the position of a decider. I did not know this, right? So these knockdown, drag out fights where he would literally be attacking me, trying to climb on top of a dresser to get an iPad, completely melting down, needing, if he wasn't, having that 1 hour of screen time, he would need constant supervision, undivided attention, and de-escalation. But I was holding this boundary, but I was observing, oh my gosh, every time I'm setting this boundary, he is going into full-on feral meltdown mode. And when he's not on a screen, I'm absolutely having to just give over my nervous system to keep him off. So at the time, I had a 1.5-year-old. My husband was working a very intense job full-time that made it so that I was caregiving alone during the pandemic without external support, okay? So I reached a point for safety and sanity where I remember sitting across from my husband in the summer and saying, I can't do it anymore. Like, I am not okay. I am in burnout. I am having suicidal ideation. We might as well get divorced and marry other people so that we can have 2 other sane adults to help us keep our kids safe. And I had this aha moment of like, I am deciding between the stability of my marriage, my own mental health, the safety of my sibling, and my son having screen time limits. And I realized I'm choosing between these horrific options, but it's not my fault. This is just the nature of my son being in burnout and a PDA-er. And this is the family context that I'm living in. And I have to decide between these 2 options. And so I said, you know what? Okay, like he can be on a screen as long as he wants. I'm not going to let him watch porn or YouTube for adults, but he can watch shows, and I'm going to open the front door so I can hear him from the porch and get my baby some fresh air, okay? And get myself some fresh air, because I have a child who's in burnout, who won't leave the house, who won't eat, who won't engage, and has very violent, aggressive meltdowns, and I'm alone. Okay, so I made this decision not based on I think screens might be good for him, or I think screens actually could be good for some neurodivergent brains, which I have since come to understand better through observation of him and the other children whose families I've worked with. Okay, so this was not a deliberate decision. This was a desperate decision. But what did I observe? What did I observe that happened for my son when I allowed the screen time? All of a sudden, he started focusing on doing things that he had not done for over 2 years, using a pencil, drawing, writing, and he would actually, and have binders filled with this because I kept them. He would repeat 3 robots that he would draw over and over again for just all day. Right? And I was like, oh my God, he's actually engaging in something, right? And there must be some form of processing going on here. Flash forward to 4.5 years later, and my son is not on screens most of the time. And that's not because I imposed limits. It's because his nervous system activation came down, because our relationship strengthened and we could actually collaborate, and he's operating mostly from his thinking brain. Okay? What does he use screens for now? He uses them to watch football clips and silly cat videos, which are his two special interests. He FaceTimes with his friends. They're writing a novel collaboratively. He is doing all sorts of things. He has an Etsy shop. He does graphic design in Canva. He edits his own videos. So screens actually became a tool, and a very important tool for him and our family. They did not cause him to have worse behavior, worse self-regulation, or worse developmental outcomes. It's just not the case that happened, okay? And so that's my story. But let me tell you about other families that I've worked with PDA children and teens. The vast majority, I can't give you a number because this is a non-random sample and I don't have data, but just from my experience working with so many families, the majority of PDA kids and teens over time benefit from reduced screen time limits and more autonomy around being able to use a screen. Okay? That doesn't mean no screen time limits and they can just go into Roblox and watch porn and stay up all night and gamble and spend your money in gaming. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is reducing the amount of autonomy losses and perceptions of you being in a position above them, which constantly activates their nervous system and undermines the relationship, which is the currency for all progress with a PDA child or teen. Okay? Are there exceptions? Yes, there are exceptions. There are PDA teens who become addicted to screens. I've worked with some families who have either had to experiment with really imposing screen time limits with either turning off the Wi-Fi, changing the password, or taking away a device. And it was extraordinarily difficult, and there was a big activation and trust cost, but it was the right decision for that family based on their observations of what the teen was doing and how they were using the screen. I know of 2 other cases where there had to be a cold turkey intervention where they stopped screens entirely, and that was the right decision. But this is a very, very small subset within the large, over 1,000 family sample that we have, okay? But of course, what are people going to be saying to you? Whether it's your therapist, whether it's the teacher, whether it's a psychologist that you're working with, they're going to be like, but what about the research? The research shows that screen time has a negative impact on developmental outcomes, bad behavioral outcomes, and impacts self-regulation. Okay, so I want to take a minute, because you're smart, and so am I, to look at this with a critical thinking cap on and understand what does and doesn't apply to our kids, okay? So we're on topic number 3. Okay, so I printed out just a very typical peer-reviewed journal article that sort of shows, quote, in quotation marks, the correlation between screen time and developmental and behavioral outcomes for preschool children. Okay, so this is a sample of almost 1,000 kids. It's not controlled or classified by some of these preschool children being autistic, ADHD, or PDA. It's just kids, okay? And it's showing that for the kids that have more screen time use, there is a negative impact on their learning, their behavioral outcomes, and their self-regulation. Okay, but what I want to show you in terms of causality and logic is that this is a correlation, and they're comparing 2 different kids, okay? And they're not controlling for why the kid is on the screen more, okay? So there's going to be an omitted variable bias. What does that mean? That means something outside of this regression equation is causing the parents to decide to use more screens. Okay? So parents who have PDA, autistic, ADHD children may be using more screens because their children already have self-regulation struggles. They already have a different developmental trajectory, and they're having trouble with their behaviors like our PDA children are, in terms of like when they're not on a screen, they're equalizing against their siblings. So a rational, mindful parent is going to be like, if I have to decide between my 2-year-old getting attacked and I'm the only mom in the house, there's no caregivers, and my kid being on kids' YouTube, I'm going to frickin' choose the kids' YouTube, okay? That does not come into play for this study. So it's like the kid is already neurodivergent, and that the neurodivergence is causing different developmental trajectory, different behavioral outcomes, and more struggles with self-regulation. And that's also a causal pathway for why they're on the screen more. Okay, so we have to understand that this is not causal. This is not proof that if you put your kid on a screen, therefore they're going to have worse self-regulation, worse behavioral outcomes, and they're not going to learn. Okay, the second thing is these studies are not considering our children. These studies are about children writ large, neurotypical children. And there's a distribution for all children. There's also a distribution for autistic children, ADHD children, and PDA children. There are not studies about PDA children and screens. Okay? Why? Because there's not even a diagnosis. So I just want to invite you to put your critical thinking cap on and understand that a psychologist, no matter how well they're trained, cannot say with full confidence and clarity that yes, your PDA child will have a negative impact because these studies about neurotypical children that haven't studied your kid are showing that in a correlation. Okay? I'm sorry, but therapists, doctors, psychologists, they're not researchers. They don't understand that this is all in development. And I'm not going to go on a rabbit hole with that, but it does bother me when I work with families who are shamed and judged because of their decisions around screens. Okay, number 4. What do people not understand about screens and PDA? I'm going to briefly talk about 4 things. Burnout, the choices that parents have to make, access needs, and positive accommodations. Okay. So the first thing I want to say, and I know that you're going to relate to this, so feel free to drop an emoji or reflect if you're listening to the podcast, is that the vast majority of parents of PDA children and teens had screen time limits before their child went into burnout. Okay? Their child did not go into burnout because they were on screens. The vast majority, including myself, had children who had screen time limits, and yet they went into burnout where they were disabled from eating or sleeping or hygiene or safety, had trouble engaging, started to have nervous system responses where they were selectively mute, completely shut down, couldn't attend school, couldn't move, their legs didn't work, and they were having meltdowns all the time. Okay, so let's think about that. Is it the screens that caused your child's burnout? I would say for the vast majority of you, you had screen time limits, right? And so we have to question this narrative of your screens are causing burnout, because we put our kids on screen because they're in burnout and they can't access anything. They can't access anything, okay? So I talk about the 4 S's. We have the 4 scenarios that allow PDAers to access engagement and regulation. The very first one is another safe nervous system. That's the most important one for all mammals. The second is screens, parentheses, book, or podcast, but for many of these kids, screens. sensory intense experiences, dopamine and novelty, or special interest. But when our kids are in burnout, they can't access the second two, the special needs and the sensory intense experiences. They can often only access being with another safe nervous system, which is often only one person, the lead parent, and that means undivided engagement without doing anything else like texting, laundry, playing with another sibling, or screens. And so then we have this reality, this truth that people don't believe, but it's actually true, which is that parents have to decide between screens and full-time caregiving, okay? And so we have these choices that are invisible to others, but that are true, and I will die on the hill of this, okay? We are either activating or accommodating our PDA child. So it's not like a neurotypical child where you get them off a screen and they're upset. They're upset. They have big emotions. They're deeply feeling, whatever it is. It's hard. It's hard to manage a kid's emotions. However, with a PDA child, it's not just a big emotion or something, a skill that they need to understand how to use. It is impacting their nervous system, which in accumulation disables them from accessing their basic needs, from engaging and connecting, and from education, learning, movement, and leaving the house, okay? So this is the context in which parents like us are making decisions, okay? So if I have to decide between myself having a meal or my son's sibling being safe, or my son eating and him being on kids' YouTube, I'm, as a rational, mindful, intelligent parent, going to choose kids' YouTube, okay? And so anyone in your life that looks at that rational decision and understands it and still judges you is not someone you want in your life, whether it's a therapist, whether it's, a friend. It's just, they would be making the same decision if they were operating within the same constraints that you are. Okay? Third, access needs. A lot of our kids struggle. People are always looking at, well, they talk, they make eye contact, so they're not high needs autistic kids. Our kids' disabling nature impacts access to things like eating, sleeping, hygiene, toileting, safety, and sometimes engagement, speech, selective mutism, okay? So screens often allow our children to access things they need to live. Many PDA children, being on a screen, they have that autonomy. It brings down the sensory input, and they can actually have a regulated enough nervous system to eat, okay? So my son was only eating 2 things, Lay's potato chips and Pirate's booty, and some popcorn, that's 3, for like 2 years, okay? And he would only eat it if he was on a screen. Also, a lot of families have to bring in the iPad or the phone so their child can have a bowel movement, so their child can bathe, right? So if we're deciding between accessing a basic need to stay alive and using a screen, we as parents are going to choose our children's mental health, well-being, and the relationship, and them accessing basic needs. So finally, and I haven't even gotten to the part where it's like, this can actually be helpful. Like, screens can actually be helpful. Sometimes screens can help neurodivergent children with learning, engagement, relationship, sensory regulation, autonomy. Okay? But because I'm not here to tell you what to do, and there are no shoulds in my world, is I want to, number 5, encourage you as a parent to just, without judgment of yourself or others, just allow yourself to look at screens as a neutral thing. They're not normatively good and they're not normatively bad. They're a tool that we can look at objectively and see how it impacts our children, our specific children in our specific home. Okay, so we want to think about the 3 C's: context, content, and clarity on your child's neurotype. Context is, how are they being used? Okay, are they being used alone, with the door shut, with headphones on, with an earshot of a parent? Is there parallel play with the parent? Are they using it to engage with another child? Are they using it to learn something new, to get initiation ideas, which can often be difficult with dopamine-bound brains? Content, we want to think about, yes, the algorithm is addictive, but like, is the Junior British baking show that I watch with my son every night together? I mean, I find it addictive, but I also find it a time when we're very connected and we're sharing. And then we want to be clear, as I said, going back to the part on the research, clarity on the decisions you have to make and how your child's brain works. Okay, so let's look at them neutrally and I'm going to give you some ideas for how to understand if positive things are happening with the screen with your child or negative things that we want to be worried about. So the first thing, the things that can be positive about screens, but we need to look at this empirically, meaning, is this true for your child? Look at the data. Are they learning something new? Okay, so as I mentioned, my son returned to drawing for the first time in 2 years during burnout because he was pausing the screen for this cartoon with robots, and then he was actually drawing the robots on the screen. He was learning. Okay, and you can observe this, and it might take some months for them to come down, especially if they're in burnout. Are they teaching themselves Minecraft? Maybe they're watching creators, which I find super annoying. They're like, bro, this is sus, whatever. The creators are annoying. I hate all the pings in the background for my own sensory experience. But, like, dude, my 5-year-old taught himself how to build in Minecraft. Like, this is amazing spatial understanding, like, coding. He couldn't even read yet. He was building these enormous and elaborate, beautiful, architecturally sound landscapes with buildings. And it's like, why am I going to take that away from him if he's learning, right? And I'm not saying I don't have that anxiety of like, oh my God, he's on a screen, because I'm conditioned to think it's bad, right? There are opportunities for them to learn socially. Like my PDA son learned a lot from watching shows with kids his age, using scripts, understanding how people interact with each other. And it's the ultimate strew, right? Meaning it's an offering that they can engage with or not, right? It's very different than like being in a speech language pathologist's office and trying to like practice social interactions or having the pressure of a social group. They can just observe and decide what they're going to take from these social interactions. And you can see it play out in their interactions, right? Are they using it for communication, right? There's AAC devices. There's, kids who use the content of what they're watching to start conversations with their parents. Are your kids doing this? It can be a foundation for creativity. It can be, I know of anecdotes of because two kids in a family watch the same thing, then they have a shared storyline, or they have a shared storyline with someone at school where they can actually play based on these characters. It helps with access needs, as I mentioned. And then there's the thing that we have to talk about, which is the holistic view, which is understanding the impact of screens on everyone else in the family. And yes, there is a negative, quote, negative impact on, the other kids want more screen time, but there's also the possibility that choosing more screens is allowing you to like take a deep breath, have a meal, go to the bathroom, take a shower, and maintain your marriage, okay? And so I want you to think about that as like, it's okay if that's what's happening, right? The family system is part of what allows a child to have well-being over their long-term life, as well as the parent's mental health. Okay, another thing is initiation. Like both my sons, my PDA son, when he was coming out of burnout, some of the very first things he did were seeing something on YouTube, like, we're going to build this volcano, or we're going to build this little bird feeder. And he would be like, I want to do that. And it was the first time in like a year that he had wanted to do something. And so he came up with that initiation idea from what he watched on a screen, and then it translated into the possibility of engagement and connection. Okay, so we want to be looking for those things. Is that what's happening? And if so, can we relax a little bit and see how screens as a neutral entity are facilitating positive things in your particular family? Okay, so also screens provide autonomy. Screens provide the ability for the child to be above something, the decider. For a PDA child, that's going to be extraordinarily regulating to their nervous system. It's an accommodation, right? And I would much rather have my PDA son have autonomy over a screen and control over a screen than another human being, because that impacts the family system. Okay, now let's take screens as neutral and see how they can play out as a tool in a negative way. Okay, algorithms are addictive. They're designed to be addictive. Okay, so, the YouTube algorithm is terrifying. I don't like to have my son on YouTube. And so one of the things that I think about is like, he always has to be in earshot, and I need to be able to see what's happening, because it can so quickly go into these sexual or violent or inappropriate areas, right? When kids are on screens, they might be not doing as much movement, leaving the house. But again, we want to think about the causality. Is this because they just went into burnout and what causes that is actually the burnout, and they're using a tool like a screen to support them in burnout? Or this can happen where you've been parenting in a low demand way and accommodating for like a year and a half or two, and they're just getting more and more addicted, meaning like constantly seeking more dopamine through like sexual content, violent content, sort of like, a roulette wheel type of response. But only you can determine if that is how the screen is being used. Okay? The argument that they're not learning skills of self-regulation because they're on a screen. Okay? So I understand that this is potentially a rational argument. At the same time, many of our children, all of us who are here, have a child with a nervous system disability. Okay, that means whenever their brain neurocepts or subconsciously perceives they lack autonomy or they don't have equality, it's going to activate. That's not a lack of skills. That's how their brain works. Okay? Just like how my nervous system will activate if I get held up at gunpoint. That's not a lack of self-regulation skills. That's what my body's supposed to do. Okay? And our children's bodies are reacting to the perception that they're in danger or under life threat. Okay, so we have to understand that these kids are not needing to learn self-regulation in these moments. They're actually needing to be accommodated so that they can get back into their thinking brain where they can actually learn. Okay? So again, as I said, the vast majority of parents whose kids now don't have screen time limits did not start that way. They went into burnout and started to be disabled from accessing life and the things they need to stay alive, and then their parents introduced screens. Okay? And so they're getting them to a place where they can actually function, and once they're back in the thinking brain, that's where we can learn skills. Okay? Does it impact brain chemistry? Probably. But you know what else impacts brain chemistry? Constantly perceiving threat and thinking you're going to die in your body, which is what our kids are experiencing. Okay? Second, some parents report sensory overwhelm with screens. So I want you to tune in to that, right? If there's sensory overwhelm, and it's more activating for your child to be on a screen, then we can consider this is a negative impact, right? And allow yourself to be objective, right? There is inappropriate content, porn, addictive games, terrible racist language, sexuality, violence. Like, of course we have to set boundaries around these things, right? But as parents of PDAers, what we have to understand is that when we set a boundary, it will be a big activation from the nervous system. That's just how it goes. okay? So again, seeing screens as neutral and then seeing how it plays out with your particular child. Number 6, what can we do as parents to maintain our sanity? Here's 5 tips. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is I want you to let go of the shame and blame that you feel and look at it objectively, which I hope I supported you to do earlier in this training, which is the choices that you're making, right? You're not deciding between my kid being on a screen or them playing outside. You're deciding between your mental health, well-being, safety in your family, stability, their mental health, and the relationship often, okay? So that's not your fault. That's just the situation. It's how your child's brain works. It's the situation you're in. I know how judged you are. I've been judged myself, but I'm here to tell you it's okay. Okay? Lots of parents are in your situation. Hundreds and hundreds and thousands of other parents, and frankly, even parents of neurotypical kids. So remember when I referenced this study, which was done with preschoolers of neurotypical preschoolers, only 15% of these parents were following the pediatric guidelines about only 1 hour of screen time for 4 and 5-year-olds, okay? So that's a majority of parents. They're just not talking about it, and they're just embarrassed. Number 2, we want to think about the 4 S's, okay? So remember, safe nervous system, screen, sensory intense experience, special interest. So if they're not on a screen, it is going to take more effort to introduce some of those alternatives of like one-on-one attention from you, maybe sensory intense or novel experiences, a new toy, going out on the trampoline, going to a water park, simple things like jumping on the bed and you throwing pillows at them, but it will mean engagement, right? Like we can't just expect them to get off the screen and play independently because they need those constant nervous system signals of safety. Special interest, whatever that is, and you. Okay, so sensory intense experience, safe nervous system, screen, special interest. Number 4, I want to encourage you to think outside of the box about screen time limits. Okay, so often, because this is such a charged topic, we think about like screen time limits and very strict, like 2 hours a day, or like taking the reins off and then the kids are just up all night and they get total autonomy over their screens. Okay, so there's a lot of gray space in between those extremes, right? So I'll just give you some examples in my own family. We have always had a nighttime screen time limit when the screen comes off. We have always had to be within earshot and no headphones or closed doors when there's anything other than like Minecraft or kids YouTube, so that we can intervene with the algorithm. And we have definitely put limits around the type of content, right? So I don't allow Roblox, for example, because there's lots, and my kid is only 10. So if you're doing Roblox and you have a teenager, no judgment. I'm just giving you an example of what content is appropriate. Now here's where it gets sticky. This is point number 5. Parents of PDAers want to be able to say, get off the screen. Like they want the child or the teen to get off the screen when they tell them to. But the PDAer, especially if they're in burnout and you're reestablishing a relationship, is not going to do that. They're going to activate and equalize or fixate on not getting off because you told them to. That's how their brain works, okay? So when we set a boundary, we really have to understand that it's based on what we are going to do in response to them, okay? So what that means is if you're deciding to set a boundary, and that can be absolutely the right choice, whether it's around content, around the amount of time, around turning it off at a certain time of the evening, there will be an activation when you do this, meaning they will get upset and have a nervous system activation. And 2, we have to focus on what we're doing. So it's going to look like turning off the Wi-Fi, changing the password, taking away the iPad, okay, which is a loss of autonomy. However, it may be worth it in the larger context of, are they getting addicted? Are they having negative sensory experiences? Is this negatively impacting their basic needs, engagement, and well-being over time? Okay? So finally, number 7, and I think about this a lot because listen, I'm 43, I grew up without all of these devices, I'm a huge reader, and I have a love-hate relationship with screens and social media. Okay, so in an ideal world, I would prefer us probably not to have all these screens because I do think it's not great for anyone's mental health, including children. However, screens are not going away, okay? They're here to stay. You're here with me either, live on a social media feed and I'm in Michigan and you're wherever you are in the world. And, you're going to engage maybe with the podcast on your phone, okay? Or on YouTube or whatever it is. So the truth of the matter is there's nothing we can do in the big picture to prevent screens from entering into their lives, right? In the sense of eventually, as they get older and as they're grown-ups, the world is going to be increasingly digital and screen oriented. That's just the reality, right? I'm not saying I want it that way, but that's how it is. So I really want you to feel into this idea that it's not your fault, right? We can't push down the blame onto the individual household and the individual parents and put the responsibility for all our children's struggles with mental health and self-regulation, all of it, just on screens. This is a much bigger issue. Our kids can't access school. They're having trouble accessing medical care. We don't have community. We're living in a time of great uncertainty. There's lots of reasons our kids are anxious. Okay, it's not just screens. Okay, it's a structural issue and screens are part of this puzzle. But pushing down the responsibility to each individual household instead of looking at the big picture is just doing a disservice to families. Okay? And I think within the context of screens not going away, we really want to understand how to help them manage this while they're still under our roofs, right? I love seeing my son starting to learn more about video editing than I know and, putting up his Etsy store for his tie-dye on my social media platform and teaching him about entrepreneurship, playing with ChatGPT with him, of trying to use it for him to help initiate an idea of you're working on conditioning your legs for football. Let's ask ChatGPT for an idea for a 20-minute workout for a 10-year-old that helps with leg strength, right? And so, I'm trying to navigate this fear and uncertainty by leaning into supporting him to navigate what will inevitably be his reality as an adult, right? And that's not to say screens are good. It's just what our reality is. And so this demonization of screens in and of themselves, putting all the responsibility on individual parent households, especially ones with neurodivergent kids, is just a distraction from larger societal issues that are influencing kids' mental health, and especially our PDA kids who can't go to school. The doctor doesn't believe them. The therapists think they're too hard, and community members think we're weird. So of course our kids are going to be anxious. We're anxious, right? So I'm going to just end this with whoever you are listening. If your child is on a screen 12 hours a day because they're in burnout and recovering, or because it's what helps their neurodivergent brain, or because it facilitates your sanity and your relationship with them, I want to say good job for making a brave decision to do what's right for your family. And if you're listening and you are a family with a PDA child and you have decided, what makes sense for my family is total screen detox, no screens. And you're being judged by other parents of PDAers, or you're being judged by actually autistic adults, you're not neurodiversity affirming, I want to say, good for you. good job making your decision based on what you know in your family, what's right for your kid. Okay? So you can trust yourself. Your child is not average. Your family is working within a system. We have to take a holistic approach, and you have a right to make decisions without shame and without guilt. Okay? So that is my training on screens. I hope it was comprehensive and I hope it helps. All right, my friends, I'm going to jump off.